It's my great pleasure today to introduce to you today's speaker, Professor Albert Park. Professor Park is a Bank of America Associate Professor of Pacific Basin Studies at Claremont and McKenna College. He received his PhD from the University of Chicago, and he is a historian of modern Korea and East Asia. He is the author of a book, Building a Heaven on Earth, Religion, Activism, and Protest in Japanese-Occupied Korea, and is a co-editor of Encountering Modernity, Christianity, and East Asia. His current research project is about studying the roots of environmentalism in modern Korean history and its relationship to locality and local autonomy. He is working as a co-principal investigator of Environlab of Asia, a research group focusing on environmental issues in Asia in Claremont McKenna College. And is working on a book project tentatively titled Imagining Nature and the Creation of Environmental Movement in Modern Korea. I believe today's talk will be part of his book project, and it is titled Revolutionary Landscapes, Ecology, Power, and Anarchism in Modern Korea. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Park.
Well, thank you. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you for coming to this talk today. Especially thank you, because I know there's a lot going on, especially in Washington, D.C. today, very important stuff, and that you've taken the time out to be here. I really appreciate it. I came here in 2006. Actually, I gave a talk in 2006, and at that point, I had met Elder Nam, and I really enjoyed my visit then. And I think it's been fantastic to see the growth of Korean studies at University of Michigan. And you have wonderful professors, administrators, and so forth. So it's really great to be here. I'm also from Chicago, so I'm from the Midwest originally. And it's nice to be back in the region. It's nice to see green. If you're in LA, there's not a lot of green, it's a lot of brown. And it's really nice to see the lush green here. And at first, yesterday when I landed, I was very excited to experience this weather. But today, no, I'm not. I actually, even though it's 96 degrees back home, I'm kind of missing the warm weather, but nevertheless, the scenery is actually quite beautiful. So for today, like Professor O said, I'm going to present some stuff from my current project, which is looking at the roots of environmentalism in Korea. And what I'm going to do today is I'll speak from my presentation. There'll be some points where I'll be speaking off and just talking very freely. At any moment where you feel like you don't really understand what I'm saying or want me to repeat anything, feel free to raise your hand and ask any questions and so forth. Okay, so agriculture destroys the environment. Destruction is defined as, quote, the action or process of causing so much damage to something that it no longer exists or cannot be repaired. And the history of agriculture has surely shown that agriculture production tore up environments and re-sculpted nature to the point where the present human and non-human conditions no longer reflected or embodied the past. Destroying landscapes through agriculture has given way to all sorts of environmental issues. The exhaustion of soil fertility through intensive farming and chemical fertilizer, degradation and erosion of soil, chemical runoffs that pollute water, high levels of methane being produced through cow and pig manure that contributes to greenhouse warming and climate change, the poisoning of human bodies, especially farmers and wildlife, through powerful chemical pesticides, and the annihilation of complex ecologies. The process of agricultural destruction and environmental alteration in modern Korea began in 1884 on a farm in Seoul. Choi Kyung-suk, a government official, established a practice farm with support from King Kojong. It was unlike any farm in Joseon, Korea. It featured seeds from the United States. It was a landscape of fertile crops that looked like they belonged on any farmland in the US Midwest. Tools of modern farming technology and foreign livestock were featured there. Overseeing experimentation and production were Koreans like Che, but also foreigners like George C. Folk, the US minister in charge of affairs in Korea, and later R. Jaffrey, a British farmer hired by the Korean government to teach American and British techniques of farming. He later passed away because he ate spoiled oysters in a can. So, yeah. The chosen state's support of agriculture through this practice farm is no surprise. It's in line of the long history of governments in Korea giving peasants practical help to ensure a healthy output of crops. Improving infrastructure for farming through irrigation and land reclamation projects, for example, was seen as a moral responsibility based on Confucianism to protect and uplift people's everyday lives. What makes the 1884 practice farm stand out from past customs and conventions, however, was its construction as a new institution for aligning agriculture and the environment in Korea with the modern. That is, agricultural experimentation, education, and production would be based on learnings and guidance coming from the West for the purpose of increasing wealth and becoming civilized and modern. This simple but decisive act was a breaking moment in the environmental history of the Korean Peninsula. Despite its transformative effect, there's a glaring omission of agriculture's environmental impact on the peninsula in the historiography of environmentalism in Korea. There are a few factors that explain this oversight. First, the environmental history of Korea has been a slowly developing field. Unlike the study of the environment in Japanese and Chinese studies, which have been propelled by ruptures and catastrophes like the Ashio copper mine, the Minamata poisoning, Fukushima, and the current environmental problems in China, there are very few major environmental events in Korean history that have pushed Korean studies to study the environment with urgency. In other words, there's a lack of ruptures, environmental ruptures. Second, in its infancy, the field of environmental history in Korea focuses on environmental issues in urban settings. In fact, it's in line with modern Korean studies, privileging the urban over the rural as the primary site of investigation. This bias towards the urban has led studies to locate the origins of environmental issues and environmentalism in the 1960s with the rise of pollution in cities under Park Chung-hee's regime. Third, people today generally avoid thinking about agriculture as a destructive process, especially under back-to-land movements and organic food drives. Working with soil was a way to reconnect to nature and live a more balanced, authentic life, unlike the busy, fragmented, and artificial life in the city. People, especially inhabitants of the urban, have desired the rural and farming for their healing powers. Omitting agriculture's impact on the Korean landscape from historical narratives and memories causes the standard historiography to ignore the harsh realities of agriculture, farming, and overall rural life. It particularly ignores the destructive traits and consequences of the industrialization of agriculture. Fueled by the new demands of capitalism, this systematic mechanization of agriculture for the large-scale production of commodities introduced regimes of farming that broke from traditional practices. It introduced monoculture cultivation, intensive animal farming, heavy reliance on chemical fertilizers, and the widespread use of pesticides and herbicides. This form of industrialization sped up agriculture's transformative effect on landscapes, causing the decline and loss of biodiversity. Today, I'd like to introduce a story about environmentalism in Korea. It's a story that deviates from the standard narratives of the environmental history of Korea. This story is about the rise of industrial agriculture before 1945 and the ascendance of rural and agricultural-based environmentalism after the Korean War. These environmental drives organized around the struggles to address and reconfigure the hierarchical relationship between humanity and the environment and between groups of people, particularly between the state and the people. Hierarchy produced uneven forms of power that fueled agroecosystems under the industrialization of agriculture in Korea. Nature and certain groups of people encountered intense levels of control that tried to limit their autonomy for the growth of the political economy. Restrictions, tension, conflicts, and metabolic rifts grew out of the hierarchy within agroecosystems. This story will be told in 4 parts: the crisis of representation and guidance under the decline of the Confucian order, the rise of industrialization of agriculture, main aspects of the rule in agricultural-based environmentalism, and finally, the relationship between hierarchy, anarchism, and these agricultural-based rule movements. The third part particularly looks at a drive to negotiate hierarchy and uneven forms of power through autonomous life assemblages, or what I call ALAs. Each part of the story will provide a brief overview of the developments and thoughts. It's during Q&A that I'll be happy to address anything more in depth. I'm drawing from my research, as I mentioned, on the origins of environmental movements in Korea. It's still in its initial stages, so any feedback or questions would be most appreciated. So, part 1. Koreans in the traditional period valued the environment and the non-human world as a source of knowledge. Believing elements of the non-human, such as bodies of waters, mountains, crops, embodied sacred forces. Koreans paid careful attention to the rhythms and patterns of the non-human for guidance and instruction. Shamans commonly spoke on people's behalf to and communicate with the divine forces in the non-human, while guardians of Pungsu, which is geomancy, carefully interpreted the dynamics of the non-human world to identify appropriate areas of construction and design. Confucian and Buddhist cosmology established a network of social and ecological relations that gave insights and revelations about present and future happenings. Natural disasters, such as earthquakes, foretold political dictates of the divine. This hybrid network of knowledge based on the non-human gave nature a sacred value. Giving it sacred value, of course, did not prevent large-scale extraction of non-human resources and the reshaping of natural landscapes for human endeavors. Yet there were popular beliefs that the non-human world ran according to its own logic without human intervention and can never be fully controlled. Its sacred being should move people to withhold from exploiting the non-human world and dominate it. And I don't want to romanticize traditional views of nature. I mean, of course, there are less than sacred views of nature and negative views of nature as well. But there was a prevailing view of nature as sacred, something spiritual and so forth. Late 19th century Korea was a period of breakdown that Charles Taylor defines when people were expelled from their old forms before they could find their way in the new structure. The 1876 Treaty of Qionghua, the modernization of the state and society by the chosen government, and the Kabul reforms combined to generate a crisis of epistemology. Prevailing knowledge, which drew its basis in authority from Confucianism, was under siege as people questioned its value, with the chosen state breaking society away from its Confucian roots through new reforms. This moment of breakdown with intellectual material changes pushed to the forefront questions about where knowledge should be derived. What does it mean to be human? And what is the evolutionary process of humans, non-humans, and society? Differing conceptions on the value of the non-human and the relationship between humanity and the non-human sprung forth from the discussions and debates on these questions. Among the strands of diverse systems of knowledge circulating in the late 19th century, civilization and enlightenment discourse and Tongak religion furnished new language from which Koreans could derive knowledge on how to approach and treat the human world, non-human world. Tongak valued the non-human world as sacred. A single force, according to Tongak leaders, created, unified, moved, and gave being to all in the universe. This force resided in all and thereby gave them a divine nature. As such, the non-human and human shared a sacred identity, and more importantly, an organic connection. As a monistic religion, Tongak abhorred duality and gave emphasis to balance in the environment, society, and the universe. This religious position was never translated into the creation of a new moral and ethical system on how humans should treat the non-human world. And scholars, in fact, argue that Song Byung-hae and Choi Jae-woo, the leaders of Tongak, spoke about a hierarchical system where humans were above animals. Still, by the late 19th century, Tongak furnished an ecological worldview from which people could draw up the belief of the need to seek a mutual relation of coexistence between the human and the non-human under modernity, in which both are equally valued. Civilization and enlightenment drew up an ecological order that gave more weight to the division between the human and non-human, a dualistic relationship. Figures in the civilization enlightenment movement who were influenced by modernists in Japan imagined civilization enlightenment as a process leading to the achievement of the modern, the highest stage of history and humankind. Moving society successfully through this process required mastery over the non-human world. That is, humans should no longer be bound and controlled by the laws of nature. Instead, they should study and understand nature in order to apply them toward human prosperity and abundance. Far from being an uncontrollable force, operating under its logic that humans cannot escape and must abide by its laws, nature, according to the Civilization Enlightenment group, should be subjugated to the will and purposes of humanity. This ecological viewpoint from the Civilization Enlightenment group did not de-emphasize valuing and respecting nature, or did it call for the abuse of the non-human world. Yet with humans as a source of legitimacy and creative force behind standards, it envisioned the unification of natural and human history for the production of the new self and the re-engineering of society for the achievement of the modern. Their views opened up the possibility of believing that nature can be transcended. So, part 2. The late 19th century featured a tapestry of systems of knowledge from which Koreans could draw ideas about how should they think about nature. Materially, the Chosun state adopted reforms in the late 19th century that started a process of fundamentally reshaping Korea's agricultural landscape for the purposes of building a new political economy. Influenced by civilization enlightenment discourse, the state pursued the commercialization of agriculture through industrialization for the purposes of increasing the wealth of the nation. Signs of capitalist agriculture preceded the late 19th century, of course. Large-scale cultivation of lands increased the production of agricultural goods, producing surpluses that were sold at markets. Still, the majority of farmers who were subsistence cultivators performed traditional ways of farming, such as the diversification of crops and the use of natural fertilizers. From traditional practices, peasants and farmers in the Chosun period carved out agro-ecosystems that forged landscapes which were, according to Don Worcester, carefully integrated, functional mosaics that retained much of the wisdom of nature. They were based on close observation and imitated the natural order. Despite making changes in nature, subsistence agriculture preserved much of its diversity and complexity. And again, I don't want to romanticize agriculture in the Chosun period or in the pre-modern period. There's a lot of very good work, especially by John Lee, who just graduated from Harvard a couple years ago, who speaks about forestry practices in the Chosun period of tearing down forests and so forth. Right? The state, after 1876, heavily invested in the modernization of agriculture that ushered changes in the non-human world. Believing agriculture as a main source of wealth for the country, King Kojong ordered the restructuring of government offices in ways that would provide more direct aid to the peasants. He called for these offices to increase arable land through land reclamation, support the production of more agricultural resources for textile production, particularly raising more silkworms. import more Western technology and information on farming, and supply them to farmers and peasants, and establish schools where foreigners would teach modern ways of farming. The creation of a model farm was at the center of the government's plan to industrialize agriculture. After traveling with a group of government officials to the United States to observe and document the modernization process in the US, Choi Kyung-suk, with the help of George Folk, convinced King Kojong to donate land and establish a model farm in Seoul in 1884. Known locally as the American Farm, it was a place of experimentation. Choi planted new varieties of seeds that were supplied by the US Department of Agriculture and breeding native and foreign livestock and horses. It had the latest farming tools from the West, including 18 different types of farming machines, especially new types of plows from the US. Though appearing to be simple in nature, the new model farm was a significant biological, technological, economic, and political agent. First, it introduced non-native species directly from the West throughout Korea. Jersey cows, Shetland ponies, pigs and sheep, and bulls from California were raised on the farm. The first crops produced from the seeds coming from the US were allowed to go to seed. Those seeds were then collected and distributed to 305 local areas throughout Korea with exact instructions of how to take care of those seeds and raise the crops. Second, it cultivated, promoted, and spread the mechanization of farming based on Western methods. Third, the model farm framework introduced a method of farming that relies on outside knowledge and resources to experiment, replicate results, and increase production. It encouraged a scientific approach to farming that would lead to techniques and discoveries that would be applied to other areas of the country to produce similar results to what was achieved on the model farm. In this sense, this method called for the uniform production, or what we would say monocropping. Fourth, the model farm introduced a method of farming that calls for top-down government supervision. Close surveillance was necessary so the state could ensure continued production of agriculture for the wealth and prosperity of the nation. And when I found out about this American farm, I was very excited. If you're a historian or you study history, when you find these little things, it gets so exciting. You wouldn't imagine that discovering a farm would be so exciting. But you really, and so I was thinking, am I putting too much into it about this American farm, right? Because it's just a simple farm in the end. And it remained all the way up into the 1900s, and then the Japanese later created their own agricultural school called the Suwon Agricultural School and Forestry. But I have to say, I think there is something there. Because you have to ask yourself, why does the Korean government, Kojong, have to build a model farm with the support of Americans particularly, and the British, when all evidence points Koreans were very good farmers, very good farmers. They were producing a great deal by the 19th century with the commercialization of agriculture. So you really have to ask yourself then, there's something, what's the big deal? Well, there's something there just by them starting, because the history shows that Koreans didn't need this. They could do it on their own. So that's where I think there's something there. I might be proven wrong in the end, but there's something there, I believe. The simple establishment of the model farm marked the beginning of a process of speeding up the alteration of increasing the pressures on land for the birth of agroecosystems. And I've been referring to that constantly. Here's the definition. It's an ecosystem reorganized for agricultural purposes, a domesticated ecosystem. It's a restructuring of the trophic process of nature, that is, the process of food and energy flow in the economy of living organism. Such a restructuring involves forcing the productive energies in some ecosystems to serve more exclusively a set of conscious purposes, often located outside, namely the feeding and prospering of a group of humans. Combined with other agricultural reforms, the model farm constructed large-scale agroecosystems that are beginning to reconstruct the Korean landscape. The government and reformers who wanted to modernize Korea hoped for a landscape that mirrored the landscapes of farms in the US and the West. Japanese colonialism dramatically scaled up and intensified this process. It was a process that started in the countryside through the intensification of agricultural production, that is, capitalist agriculture. Through the elaborate capitalist agricultural system that focused on agricultural cultivation for export and not subsistence living, the colonial state laid down a process of agricultural growth that started the reduction of the environment's biodiversity and complexity. Intensive monoculture and the introduction of chemical fertilizer were two of the main factors behind this process of reduction. Monoculture became the standard of farming in the colonial area as a result of the state's focus on expanding the production of rice. The colonial state concentrated on building a rice export market to satisfy the growing demand by the Japanese for inexpensive rice. They rehauled the agricultural economy by introducing so many different types of programs. One of the most famous programs was the program to increase rice production. And it's through that program that they forced the landlords, Korean landlords, working with the colonial government, was pushing peasants to use new types of seeds, but particularly to use more and more chemical fertilizers to increase rice production. By the late 1930s, rice ranked first in total output of agricultural goods in Korea, close to 60%. As Holly Stevens has pointed out, and Holly Stevens has wrote a really fantastic dissertation, she's at University of Edinburgh now, on agricultural policies in the 20s and 30s in Korea. She points out one of the main resources of supplied to peasants was chemical fertilizer with a high amount of nitrogen, potassium, phosphorus, or ammonium sulfate. The consumption of chemical fertilizer before 1919 was 48,000 tons. By 1937, nearly 570,000 tons of chemical fertilizer was applied on farms. Large-scale production of fertilizer in Korea was carried out by corporations like the Japanese Nitrogen Corporation, which invested nearly 62.5 million yen in the construction of the Korean Nitrogen Fertilizer Corporation, which was in the northern part of Korea. Organic fertilizers were produced, but all of those were actually shipped to Japan, right, and did not remain in Korea. The colonial state constructed an agricultural system built upon a culture of monoculture and the use of chemical fertilizer. The intensification of this agricultural system only grew in South Korea. The UN Reconstruction Agency, which is known mostly as the UNKRA, during the Korean War, which was tasked with mapping out South Korean economic development, pushed the government to intensify land reclamation and agricultural production. Dr. Pedro E. Abelarde, an economics affairs officer for the UN Korean mission, stated, "Climatic conditions, terrain, and population density in the country necessitated an intensified system of agricultural production that would require both irrigation and heavy utilization of natural and commercial fertilizer." And as he wrote this, he stressed this, in order to restore the rapidly progressing erosion of the soil. What had happened is that there was so much chemical fertilizers used during the colonial period, especially from 1937 to 1945, that most scientists in Korea, South Korea, said the soil quality is heavily eroded. Now, the biggest problem was at that point was, okay, so you just need fertilizer, right? But where is all the chemical fertilizer being produced? In North Korea, because that's where the factories were. So if you look at any of the US military government documents from 1945 to 1948, they are scrambling to find nitrogen fertilizer, buying it abroad from US, from the West, Japan, so that they can have fertilizer. And this goes into, all the way into the Korean War, where the UN then is searching for chemical fertilizers. Which really brings up, I think, an interesting point. When people look at 1937 to 1945, they say, oh, you know, Korea was really saved from the damages of World War II. And that's true because it was never bombed officially like Japan was. But that's physical violence that you see. But if you really look, there's more hidden violence. A violence against the soil, against the nature. So there was actually wartime damages. It's just not visible to the eye. So I think that's something key to learn, really think about, that there was wartime damages, 37-45, and dramatically affected South Korea. And we have to remember, South Korea was the agricultural breadbasket of Korea. Right? And that's where most of the rice was going for the peninsula as well. Right? North, it's more dry. It doesn't have the ideal farming conditions like the South does. It's not wet. So the Korean state later, under Park Chung-hee, built so many, like 5 or 6 fertilizer plants. And eventually, they became a net exporter of chemical fertilizer. And we have to remember that the chemical fertilizer program was connected to the chemical industrialization program under Park Chung-hee. Founded in 1961, Nonghyup, the National Agricultural Cooperative Federation, became the sole distributor of chemical fertilizer. As a government institution, Nonghyup was nothing like a traditional cooperative, as it represented the interests of the state. It supplied services, as one scholar wrote, required of modernizing agriculture sector, marketing, agro-input supply, agriculture credit, and other banking services. So if you're a farmer in the 50s and 60s, you had to heavily rely on Nonghyup. Nonghyup, in return, said if you want the money, you want credit, you want capital, then you have to use our supplies, meaning particularly you have to use all these chemical fertilizers, various seeds that we introduce, and so forth. So one could say they had a choice, but not really, to take the aid of Nonghyup. And this extends all the way into the 1970s with the Saemaul Undong, the New Village movement, which some people use the word the NVM. And the Saemaul Undong, again, a program under Park Chung-hee for rural development, was pushing Korean farmers to use chemical fertilizers and pesticides, right? Which, if it's well documented, was extremely poisoning the farmers at the time. So in the 70s and 60s, there's these government institutions and mechanisms that aren't necessarily forcing, right, the farmers to farm in a certain way. But if the farmers really wanted help and assistance, and think about it, there's no other areas of assistance other than the government at that time, they had no choice but to follow the directions and rules of the state. So I would argue it's in line with the agricultural policies, are in line with the authoritative policies of Park Chung-hee with the industrial development in the urban sector. Since the colonial period, components of capitalist agriculture combined to produce new agro-ecosystems. These agro-ecosystems stood out from anything before. They rearranged natural processes in a compressed period of time. Capitalist agriculture was consequently, according to Worcester, a movement toward the radical simplification of the natural ecological order in the number of species found in an area and the intricacies of their interconnections. Capitalist agriculture, ushered in a process of slow violence against the environment. Rob Nixon, who's at Princeton now, defines slow violence as, quote, a violence that occurs gradually and out of sight, a violence of delayed destruction that is dispersed across time and space, an attritional violence that's typically not viewed as violence at all. Since the 1920s, there has been an incremental assault on the environment in the rural that has caused a deterioration of nature that cannot easily be seen or identified by the naked eye, such as the deterioration of the soil environment and the degradation of air quality. These are scientifically convoluted cataclysms in which the full effects and casualties are postponed over generations. Indeed, the organic content of soil has decreased steadily since the colonial period, moving from 4.4% in the 1920s to 2.4% in the 1980s. By the middle of the 1980s, it becomes 1.8%. So, part 3. So I would argue a new type of environmentalism arose in the 1950s in relation to this environmental milieu in the rural, against the slow violence. The rural and agriculture-based environmentalism materialized through the efforts of farmers, intellectuals, and social activists to construct alternative rural communities. The visionaries behind these rural communities perceived them as spaces where egalitarian communities would be linked to and enmeshed in the rhythms and forces of nature. It was imagined as ecological spaces where rifts between humanity and the environment would be overcome through a system of interconnection that would achieve harmonious relations between all living beings. Though not rejecting the market outright, they were critical of state-led capitalist modernization that has emphasized profit, relentless growth, and control. For them, the system of interconnection became the means to confront state-led development, especially toward agriculture, and carry out, ultimately, social renewal. Some of the most well-known institutions and organizations behind this new wave of environmentalism communities have been the Cheongnonghae, the Association of Righteous Farming, the Pulmul School, and Hansalim. Each of those organizations has distinct qualities and characteristics, yet they also share similar plans, beliefs, and platforms for social change that help constitute a rural agricultural-based environmentalism. I'd like to take a moment to outline these similarities, and we'll be happy to answer any questions about them, about the particularities during the Q&A. So if you see right here, this is right here is Hansalim. In the middle is pictures of Pulmul Hakgyo, and onto your left is the Cheongnonghae. The Pulmul Hakgyo was founded in 1958 by Lee Chang-gap, who's in the middle, who was part of the non-church movement, a follower of Hamseokon. It's currently located in Hongdong in Chungcheong-namdo. The Pulmul School later expanded by building an agricultural college, consumer cooperatives, and producer cooperatives. The Cheongnonghae was established in 1976 by followers of the non-church movement in Gyeonggi-do. These followers founded the organization to promote organic farming following a visit by Kotani Junichi, the founder of Aunikai. Kotani is to your left. Hansalim was founded in 1986 as an agricultural cooperative that connects farmers and urban consumers. The organization had its roots in movements in Wonju that arose in response to massive flooding in the area in 1972. Led by figures such as Chang Il-sun, who's here on your right, and later the poet Kim Ji-ha, the Wonju group pushed for the creation of new rural communities and a new form of ecological-based social development. And their ideas were later incorporated into Hansalim. And Hansalim, out of all the group, is mostly influenced by Tongak Cheondogyo ideas. The other two groups are Christian-oriented. This rural-based agricultural environmentalism, was based on a monistic philosophy that these groups espouse. This philosophy viewed the world as one unitary organic whole with no independent parts. In large part, this view was derived from religion from the colonial period that spoke of the universe as founded and sustained by a single force. And as I mentioned, these were ideas found in progressive forms of Christianity and in Tongak and Cheondogyo. Inspired by Tongak in 1989, the 1989 Hansalim Manifesto announced that everything in the universe, including Earth, nature, and humanity, originated from a single source of energy that gives and sustains life. Everything in the universe, according to the manifesto, is interconnected. The ideal state of humanity, therefore, is one that, quote, respects symbiosis as a basic order of nature. For Hansalim, it is a symbiosis that stresses intimate human-to-human contact, which would enable the overcoming of all forms of alienation and the fullest development of personality. Yet, it is not, quote, limited only to the relationship between human beings, but encompasses the relationship between animals and plants, inorganic substances, and even machines. Founders of Hansalim, the Pulmur Hakgyo, in Cheongnoe, believe the responsibility for protecting all aspects of the world and ensuring a symbiosis between all things lied with people. So therefore, individuals should confront anything that causes conflicts and divisions. So you see this in the Hansalim Manifesto, where they proclaim the obsession for growth has made capitalism and communism alike. Both the two have pursued only economic growth and technological progress. Consequently, centralized monitoring and control by technical bureaucrats and intensifying economic conflicts. This has also led to social imbalance, bringing about the degeneration of environment and the exhaustion of natural resources. The industrialization of the economy and life overall prevented symbiosis in the world, particularly in the rural. Overcoming the state required the construction of a new life, in this case, 생명. In some ways, the concept of 생명 was similar and possibly derived from the concept of 생활, which is a concept during the colonial period that stressed the unfolding of a holistic being that was suppressed due to material conditions. There appeared to believe that the outcomes of the construction of a holistic being would be an interconnected figure who would value, pursue, and sustain a balanced and symbiotic life. And it's in my opinion that 생명, 생활, and 생태, which is ecology, are all interrelated. And so colonial discourses on 생활 influences 생명 and 생태 today. The rural and agricultural-based environmentalism that I presented sought an ecologically driven social renewal for the birth of a new life. This drive for social renewal took place through the construction of a new system of interconnectedness. One important feature of this system was to push for environmental sustainability and the promotion of biodiversity through organic farming. In 1975, the Pulmur School was the first institution to teach organic farming. In particular, they introduced duck farming as a way for organic rice farming. It entailed the introduction of rice on rice paddies for weed and pest control, fertilization, and increasing rice growth. Cheongnoe was established in 1976 and was influenced by, of course, Kotani Junichi, as I mentioned earlier. In his visit to the farmers of Cheongnoe, Kotani, according to Yeon Jae-paek, who is currently a graduate student at Australian National University, who is writing a really exciting book on the origins of organic farming in Korea. Yeon Jae-paek wrote, Kotani preached that chemical farming is against the will of God and urged the audience to convert to organic farming. From its beginning, Hansalim and farmers have committed to a strict standards of organic farming, which includes sustainable ways of raising livestock, such as cattle and pigs. For example, there has been a strict standards against GMOs and antibiotics, and there's been a policy of feeding livestock with what they say native grains. Figures behind Cheongnoe, Hansalim, and the Pulmur Hakgyo adopted cooperatives as an instrument to ensure a communal approach to the organic farming that would be sustainable over time. Besides, for the benefits of boosting the economic power and influence of farmers through the pooling of labor and resources, cooperatives were valued for the abilities to structurally fashion ethically and morally based social relationship from a society atomized by capitalism. So all three groups really believed in cooperatives. It's along the lines of the philosophy of interconnectedness, because cooperatives, at the heart of it, argue for interconnectedness. There should be no divisions between people within the cooperatives, but also in the business model between the consumers and the producers. A lot of them drew their inspiration for cooperatives from, and I had talked about this during lunch with the fellows, from Denmark, which I talked about in my first book. Denmark in the 1920s and 1930s was seen as this agricultural paradise because they had rebuilt the economy, which was severely depressed, through cooperatives. But not only through cooperatives, through these things called folk schools. And folk schools were the schools that where they would take young farmers, male and female, and teach them about farming, but also teach them Danish history. So it'd be kind of a school to indoctrinate nationalist ideals. But they didn't frame it that way. It was about building the spirit of people. And the Danish folk schools were religious oriented. They were Christian based. Right? And so if you look at literature from the 20s and 30s, there's so much on cooperatives. These are just some books that were written in the colonial period. Here, on to the right, 청말과 정말 농민. 청말 was the name for Denmark during the colonial period. Was written by Hong Byung-sun. Hong Byung-sun, who was the leader of the YMCA rural movement, who was the biggest proponent of the Danish cooperative model. Him and Pei Min-soo, who was from the Presbyterian Church, started all these cooperative movements. And after 1945, continued cooperative movements and spread this idea about Denmark. Right? And I really always enjoy talking about Denmark because when I first started studying this a long time ago, my interest in Denmark was purely about design, because I love modern Danish design, from its buildings, especially its furniture, right? And then to find out then, in addition to this design, that they had this agricultural paradise through cooperatives that were in fact romanticized and desired by people throughout the world in the 20s and 30s. Franklin Roosevelt sent agriculture advisors to Denmark to study the Danish model. After I found that, I couldn't help but even love Denmark even more, and it's become some like this country that I really enjoy going there, learning about the history, because it's such a small country, but yet it's had such a dramatic impact on the world. Lee Chang-gap of the Puma School considered folk schools as the key to reviving Korea. So did Han Salim. All of them believed in Denmark and wanted to become like Denmark. Finally, this system, there continue to be some maps that were within the books, okay, to introduce Denmark, because not a lot of Koreans in the 20s knew Denmark. Hong Byung-sun superimposed Denmark on top of a map of Korea that you could see on the right. And these are a couple books that he wrote. Right? And this one, to the right is very fascinating because at the tree trunk, it says agriculture cooperative. But the fruits, there's multiple fruits. There's savings and so forth, so forth. So he was really trying to explain that agricultural cooperatives have so much value. Finally, the system of interconnectedness includes drives to connect the urban and rural to form a partnership for social renewal. The agricultural and rural-based environmentalism was never anti-urban and never called for the restoration of a pastoral past. This position grew from the understanding that agricultural rural communities relied upon urban consumers to purchase and consume their agricultural goods. Moreover, a balanced and symbiotic environment cannot be achieved without the urban population, which was growing rapidly starting in the 1970s and becoming the main contributors to the degradation of the environment through consumption and productions in cities. So these agricultural groups realized that, look, we can control what's happening in the rural sector with our environmental projects, sustainability projects, organic farming, but there's also, where most people live, the cities. So in order to have, let's say, sustainability or true environmental renewal, you had to work with people in the city. So they built associations in the city. And Han Salim, for example, has an elaborate association in the cities where they have stores, right here, where they sell their agricultural goods and organic products and so forth. And you as a member purchase membership and get to shop there and so forth. And these are found in most of the cities in Korea. The interesting thing is every year, the producer side of Han Salim and the consumer side of Han Salim meet to negotiate rice prices and other prices, basically how much goods will cost. And this, if you really think about, kind of goes against a lot of processes under capitalism, because in this case you have the producers and consumers actually meeting to be truly transparent about prices, which is quite fascinating. So, this is the conclusion now. I would argue that the system of interconnectedness that emerged in relation to the agriculture and rule-based environmentalism have tried to lay down a vernacular landscape in opposition to the official landscape in the rule. Oh, sorry. Okay. Rob Nixon states that vernacular landscape is shaped by, quote, the affective, historical texture maps that communities have devised over generations. Maps replete with names and routes. Maps alive to significant ecological and surface geological features. A vernacular landscape, although neither monolithic nor undisputed, is integral to the socio-environmental dynamics of a community, rather than being wholly externalized, treated as out there, as a separate non-renewable resource. By contrast, an official landscape, whether governmental, NGO, corporate, or some combination of those, is typically oblivious to such early maps. Instead, it writes the land in a bureaucratic, externalizing, and abstracts-driven manner that is often pitilessly instrumental. Starting with the Japanese colonial state, agricultural communities in Korea, including North Korea, have encountered governments trying to absorb vernacular landscapes into an official landscape. That is, they have experience been shaped by a process of translation, which is, quote, the drawing of one world-making project into another. Through a hierarchical relationship with the state on top, this process of translation has sought to wipe out differences and create a homogeneous space through which networks of power can manipulate and regulate the environment in people's everyday life. The agricultural rule-based environmental movement, led by these organizations I spoke about, has sought to sustain vernacular landscapes in the face of the state's drive to create a uniform rural environment that can be easily controlled and manipulated through an official landscape. Through 농협, the Samuel-Lundong, FTAs, free trade agreements, the Grand Canal Project, the 4 major rivers restoration project, and installing the THAAD system in Seongju, the state has reclaimed the rural and its people and its environments as instruments for the continuous growth of a political economy that has been centered on industry and cities. The industrialization of agriculture in Korea has shown, in the words of Don Worcester, that a society cannot radically diminish the diversity of natural ecosystems for the sake of maximizing crop production, nor keep the land regimented for profit, nor augment the flow of energy through the system of introducing fossil fuels without changing the rhythms and diversities and structure of power within its various communities. Some farmers, of course, accepted state assistance to boost agricultural production and thus their overall income. Others pushed back against the state through protests and forms of social activism, like farmers in the Catholic Farmers Union in the 1970s. Today, farmers continue to protest against FTAs and agricultural policies in Seoul. And if you look at all the farmers' diaries, because there are a lot of farmers' diaries in the 1970s, a lot of them speak about, I really wanted to not use pesticides anymore because it was really making me sick. And I wanted to go more organic. But there was not only pressure from the state, but in fact, there was pressure from the community. In the 70s, immediately, if you were going to use organic or engage in organic farming, you were called a communist. And you were often said you're red, meaning you're a communist and so forth. So there's intense pressure for conformity in the 70s, 80s, and even before by rural cultivators. And you really can't blame them for many of them for accepting aid from the state, which in some cases benefited them economically. Because we have to remember and be aware of, there's very few resources for farmers at that time, other than the state. What distinguishes these movements from the drives to establish and protect vernacular landscapes through a system of interconnectedness is that organizations like Cheongnoe, the Pumusko, and Hansamim have not participated in any political movements to reach their goal. That is, they have not sought government intervention and assistance to address rural issues and build new rural communities. In fact, I would say they are very wary of getting involved in formal politics. For them, formal politics cannot achieve their main objective of ecological transformation. Transforming the political structure a special leadership and parties does not guarantee the birth of new practices, thoughts, and social organization from the top to the bottom. Reforms and processes of change initiated and coming from the top, especially by the central state, may lead to deep and long-lasting alterations of society. Yet to groups like Han Salim, rarely have political-led reforms from the top been able to reimagine society and shake up people's everyday lives to a point where they will be open to fresh paths of life, work, and overall living. They maintain that their visions of a new ecological order cannot be fully realized until the construction of a new culture of the everyday life at the local level. Individuals would collectively form this culture by rethinking norms and implementing new life ways that would be sustained over time. Ownership over this culture would continuously move individuals to construct and maintain a new ecological order anchored by autonomous life assemblages, or ALAs, where non-human and human forces autonomously interconnect to overcome divisions and establish balance. The ALAs have been the means to try to flatten out hierarchy. These agricultural groups have seen the pursuit to form an alternative ecological order anchored by the ALAs as a site of transition from the established to the emerging. What they're providing is an alternative system within the larger system. And I want to bring up this point because Karatani Kojin, the Japanese literist, said in one of his books, he says, you know, if you want people to live an alternate life, you just can't tell them, reject the system. Some people could do that, but most people can't, especially if you live in cities. So Karatani says you have to offer them something within the system. And that's what I would say that these environmental groups, environmental rule groups are doing. They're trying to offer an alternative, not only in terms of environmental living, but also social living, economic living, and so forth. Here, I would argue that the environmental movement I spoke about today has engaged a process of what we say we would call informal life politics, which, according to Tessa Mora Suzuki, says is an act of collected self-protection in the face of the profound deficits of institutional politics. Or more specifically, I would argue it has anarchist qualities. As Dong-Hyun Hwang has pointed out in his new book on anarchism in Korea, anarchism was a transnational phenomenon in Asia with and concepts that spread around Korea and throughout Asia through intellectuals and students. Some anarchists in Korea committed themselves to the use of violence to overthrow the colonial state. However, the conception of anarchism only as a mechanism of violence is more of an exaggerated view popularized by very bad contemporary movies and dramas in Korea. Sun Young Park has written that anarchy in the early 1920s was commonly, quote, referred to a variable cluster of ideas, prominent among which were the refusal to acknowledge a central governing authority and an aspiration for self-determination and freedom of association with one community. She points out that Koreans were reading Kropotkin because part of his book, Mutual Aid, A Factor of Evolution, was translated in 1921. And in that book, Kropotkin argues that human civilization advanced through mutual aid and cooperation without the need for central government. Organizations like Han Salim and the other groups that I talked about embrace this anarchistic idea of self-determination and autonomy within rural communities. They believe that communities would advance through cooperatives that would emphasize mutual aid and a form of democratic rule and government in local communities. Like Kropotkin and Proudhon, they never talk about the absence of government. And we made it very clear, anarchism never means absence of government. Instead, they describe anarchism as the absence of domination, particularly central domination. The rural, agriculture-based environmentalism has emphasized a grassroots movement to build a new system where a new holistic life would form. There are certainly issues and problems with this environmental movement and their quest to overcome rifts, something I'd be happy to discuss during Q&A. Some of the questions I'm currently reflecting over is, one, how could we measure and evaluate environmental change through the paradigm of slow violence? Can we, second, can we reconceptualize the meaning of justice in relation to the non-human? Because the concept of justice is very human-oriented. How should we think of human agency in the Anthropocene? Should we be biological agents? Should we be geological agents alongside being political or economic agents? Finally, what have been the drawbacks and problems of these agricultural groups? The last question is especially important because I certainly do not want to romanticize the rule and reinforce any binaries that overlook the cruel realities of rural life and farming. Still, what the study of a rural environmental movements or even the study of rural life and agriculture through anarchism offers is a window for tracking the formation of agency, resistance, and social change in modern Korean history. It is therefore the responsibility of students and scholars of Korean studies to make room for the study of environmentalism in the rural and tracing its many dimensions. Thank you.
Thank you very much for such an inspiring and interesting talk. Now we'll open up for the questions.
I could talk for more than 20 minutes if you like.
Thank you very much for today's talk. It was indeed very inspiring, and to know how there was existing slow violence on the soils of South Korea. It was a very interesting topic for me personally. I have actually two questions. You mentioned how the model farm of the U.S., they used chemical fertilizers that actually, you use the word poison, that poisoned the soil. Do you have any research on how it was domesticated into the South Korean soil? Any? I'm kind of interested how you conducted research on that. And so that is my first question. And my second question would be, were there any advantages for South Korea with that particular model?
Okay, thanks for the question. So perhaps I think I misspoke. I never intended to say that the American farm, which was built in 1884, used chemical fertilizers because there wasn't really chemical fertilizers at the moment. Chemical fertilizers, of course, though, become more prominent. It's through the Japanese who they introduce it. But that is that model that you're talking about. And so I could definitely answer your question about how does it become domesticated in South Korea. And how do you go about in studying it? Well, studying it is an issue just because I am a trained intellectual historian. So I've never really gone out on the ground to actually do field work. And I work now with scientists through EnviroLab Asia, the initiative that I head at the Claremont colleges. So I'm learning from them how to do it. I can't give you the exact details or the exact procedures because I'm still learning. It involves using a lot of machines to test and measure the quality of soil. And what we can do, though, is there are historical tests, meaning of the quality of organic soil. The Japanese were, as you know, were very good at measuring and keeping statistics. So you have that in the 20s and 30s. So what I could do is then trace it over time from the Japanese documents, South Korean documents, and currently in the contemporary period through my own field work. In terms of domestication of it, not only actually being absorbed within the soil, as I mentioned, it does become part of the industrial policies of South Korea under Park Chung-hee, which is connected to his overall chemical development industrial policies, to the point that chemical fertilizers become, there's so much that they actually have to export it, and they no longer need to import it. But I do want to really emphasize here how much of it was a crisis not having enough nitrogen fertilizer in the 40s and in the 50s. I would encourage you, if you're ever looking for a research project, to look at the US military records of the occupation that are at the National Archives, and then the UNRKR records, which are at the UN Archives, which I just was at last week. And it's amazing how much generals, like Hodge, for example, the leader of the military occupation, was saying this is a big crisis. It's a huge crisis, because if we have no food to grow, this is going to cause huge social unrest. And we cannot continually import rice and agricultural goods from abroad. That's just way too expensive. So that's why they really are encouraging building more and more industrial plants that would produce fertilizer. The other interesting thing is, if you ever look at the records, is there was a major energy crisis because North Korea would periodically shut off the electricity, because electricity was flowing, the power grid, because electricity, if you know anything about the geography, the river, the Yalu River, and along the river, those were the hydroelectric dams. So the electrical grids were set up in North Korea and then spun down to the south. And that still existed after 1945. But then when you have the division, North Korea says, you got to pay us now. And the US military says, okay, we'll pay you, but there's certain times where North Korea just shuts it off. And this causes mass havoc in South Korea. And the military government officials are always saying, oh, they're just, North Koreans are just playing around with us. They're really annoying us and so forth. So it's a really interesting story, 45 to 50, about the energy crisis in South Korea. In terms of the advantages, what type of advantages are you speaking of? Like political advantages?
Every aspect.
Yeah. Advantages of using chemical fertilizers or producing it? Yeah, I mean, my opinion is that, and many scientists can disagree with me, is that chemical fertilizers do more harm than good. There is systematic ways of using organic fertilizers to produce goods. And in fact, I just found out the UN was about to hire a scientist from New York in 1952 to come to Korea and set up a compost system and the use of and reprocess human waste to make organic fertilizer. So this was a project, and it eventually didn't come to fruition because the scientist didn't clear his medical, he didn't have medical clearance. So they didn't do it. So there are ways to do it, but chemical fertilizers is cheap. It's very cheap. It's very easy. If you've ever done any farming, organic farming is extremely challenging and hard. So, I mean, I'm not an economist, but it is cheaper and more efficient to use chemical fertilizers and chemical pesticides.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk, and I really enjoyed listening it. And you covered a long period of Korean history, from colonial period to contemporary. So I think it shows like a genealogy of how agriculture and ecosystem in Korea have been changed in a political and social ways. I want to go back to your explanation about these three agriculture corporations now in contemporary Korea. I would like to ask you a question about which consumer and in which class of the consumer that these corporations are targeting to. Because as from the family who's like using one of these places every day, the products in these places are a little bit like expensive than the normal places, and some of these expanding places called Jayeonderim or the Hansalim has a member system that they have to pay an annual fee, and then they have to like show the cards when they pay. So being organic and then buying but being able to using these places are kind of like highly classified in Korea. That's how I felt. And then it's also gendered, like in a certain way. So I want to ask you a question about how this idea of being organic and living organic and buying organic in Korea can be related to your idea of anarchism in everyday life when their system is highly capitalized in a very explicit way.
Right. That's a really good question. You're right. So Han Sarim, then there's other agricultural cooperatives like Dude and I Co-op Korea and so forth. But let's just take Han Sarim, because I think Han Sarim is the most progressive out of all agricultural cooperatives who identify that are leading this environmental movement. You're right, they do attract mostly middle, upper class individuals in their stores, which are located throughout Korea. Most are in Seoul, but you find it throughout Korea. And right, there are barriers to the system. For example, if you can't afford the membership system, you can't shop there. And I've had conversations with them, and the Hansalim leaders recognize this. They know that it's an issue. And it, as you mentioned, it does go against certain anarchistic ideas about collective unity, breaking down boundaries, and so forth. So that's something that's certainly on their mind. The way that they would speak about it is they are trying to build a new culture. So I asked them, what are you trying to really do? Are you trying to lead a political movement? They said, no, we don't like politics and so forth. But said, we want to build a new culture. We want to build a new munhwa. And that culture needs to incorporate the people in the city. And regardless of it being people from the upper or the lower classes, we just want to draw people from the city. So they recognize the issue. But I think for temporarily, they say this is one of the consequences that we just have to endure for the time being. Do they have other models? I don't know yet. I haven't really discussed that with them. So that's the way I would answer. So I totally agree with you. And so that's where I want to kind of step back here. And I don't want to, when sometimes this talk, as you were saying, could be very inspiring, but I don't want to romanticize these groups. There's harsh realities, problems within this group. And as you mentioned, it is quite gendered. So it's farmers, right, who tend to be mostly male in the producer side, Hanzang, and then consumers who are mostly female, mostly women who stay at home and so forth. So there is that gender component. Although when I've gone to Hansalim, I have asked them, they said there are more females involved in farming, especially from the younger generation. So there is gender dynamics and gender problems. I think what they would just say is, like anyone who's thinking about social change, is this is a process. And we're trying to figure things along the way of the process. But I totally agree with you. It does, there are issues with it, for sure. Yeah.
This might be outside of the basic scope of the presentation, but I think like, microphone. Whoa. I think one of the things that's coming to my mind in terms of this sort of like vernacular landscape and like these sort of like green co-op movements in Korea and like its relationship to anarchism being more of an anarchistic type thing, and like the idea of having Korea also has like a strong anarchist history, including like in the early 20s, like the Shinmin prefecture, which it's like 2 million people living in an anarchist society. So it seems like, I guess I'm wondering what the relationship between that co-op movement and this this past example that was crushed of people doing a mass co-op system if they draw inspiration from that, or if I know there's a lot of rejection of that movement because it has nationalist tendencies within the contemporary like anarchist movement, but I guess I'm just wondering if there's any relationship.
I don't know. That's a good question. I don't know about the exact relationship. The one thing I want to clarify, and I said this earlier during my lunch with the fellows, they don't call themselves anarchists, right? And you would understand why they wouldn't call themselves anarchists. I mean, that would be, I think, almost suicide in South Korea for a group that particularly caters to an upper middle class to say that they're anarchists. So it's my interpretation of it. So I really do want to trace the genealogy of anarchism from the colonial period up until this period. So it's my interpretation. And maybe I broached that and they were very wary of any associated anarchism. From what I know, I don't know specifically the associations or groups that you're talking about, if there's any relationship. I know that it's interesting. I don't think that there's much dialogue between Hansalim, Pulmu, and the Cheongneunghae. There's not as much dialogue as I would think that there would be. Hansalim in particular seems to be very independent. Although when it comes to like nuclear issues, they'll work with other NGOs and other groups and so forth. But especially with Hansalim, I feel like they work more independently. They are the largest cooperative, and they are very popular, and I think they've really grown in popularity. When I was there in Seoul over the summer, I met with Hans Halim, and one of the representatives was like, "Oh, did you watch TV yesterday?" I said, "No, I didn't." And she goes, "Well, there was this famous singer, Hyori, who talked about Hans Halim and how she's a Hans Halim member now." And she was very happy about that because she's like, Hansalim is becoming more and more mainstream. And it also shows the strength and influence of Hansalim today. So I don't think that they would associate with any known anarchist groups, especially anarchist groups that are politically oriented. I really want to stress they really are against anything political. Even though you may interpret what they're doing as political, they're not interpreting it as political. They use the word cultural.
Thank you for the great talk. And I'm a doctoral student in urban and regional planning. I'm looking at the sustainability transitions of the food system, urban government in South Korea. So I learned a lot from your lecture today. I think my questions are two. So first question is, I was wondering how you'd relate the worldwide Green Revolution movement in 1970s to this Korean specific context, the origin of organic farming and other things you mentioned in the lecture. And I think my second question was quite covered by previous questions about the commercialism aspect of the environmentalism groups in South Korea. So I guess my last question is, are you considering on looking into the further aspects of those groups, like going beyond the creation itself, like how it unfolds in the modern or post-modern South Korea society?
Sorry, can you repeat that question again?
From my understanding, you have covered the creation of those environmentalism groups. So I was wondering, are you considering on the more later phase of those groups?
Yeah.
Going beyond the creation itself.
Right. So more contemporary.
Yeah. How it is unfolding.
Yeah. I'd like to, although then the question arises: is that really history? That's something I always face because from my historian colleagues, I plan to. That now requires a lot of field work, where I'm interviewing, observing, taking notes about their everyday life, trying to apply certain anthropological methodologies. So yes, I'm very interested. I mean, at the heart of it, my work is always about trying to understand social change and transformation, particularly how it happens. And I'm very interested in alternative societies, in the creation of alternative societies. So I like to see how, from historically, the creation of these movements then plays out today and how they're influencing social structures today. So to answer your question, yes, definitely I will cover that probably in the last couple of chapters. In terms of the Green Revolution that you asked about, yes, that was certainly a force in South Korea. And as many of you know, of course, the Green Revolution revolutionized farming, particularly in raising agricultural output through the use of various types of pesticides, chemical fertilizers, new farming techniques, genetically modified crops, seeds, and so forth. And in South Korea, there was the direct influence from the Green Revolution where Park Chung-hee wanted to create a new strain of rice. That strain of rice ultimately became the Dongyil, the unification strain, which was developed by, I may get the name of this institution wrong, by the International Rice Association, which, okay, on the outside, that doesn't look like it's be a very interesting place to study, the International Rice Institution or Association. But it's actually a very important player in the Green Revolution. It's based in the Philippines. It was supported by the Rockefeller Foundation, particularly to produce new strains of rice that can be uniformly applied throughout the world to dramatically increase the output of rice. So scientists in South Korea worked with those scientists at this institute, developed the Dongyil rice strain, which then replaces native strains of rice, right? Native seeds, and so forth. So this modified seed from abroad comes in and then is dramatically affecting the ecosystem of Korea. Sure, it does produce a lot of rice, dramatic rice. But if you read the farmers' accounts, they said it was very hard to grow. It required so many inputs. The one thing I've learned about genetically modified seeds, certain seeds that are not indigenous to an area, that's from the outside, if you introduce them, you have to have a lot of inputs. You have to have a lot of fertilizer. You have to have a lot of pesticides. You have to use a lot of chemicals. And you have to continuously do this. And as we know, if you use more chemical fertilizer on the soil, it further and further erodes the quality of the soil to the point that it's just basically killing the soil. Right? And you're continuously not letting it till, not letting it just stay or go fallow. You're just farming on it. So the farmers would say it required all this stuff, all this labor. And it was very expensive to raise the crop. But this was kind of a nationalistic project by Park Chung-hee, I think, to show how much rice they can produce with this new rice strain. So there was a direct connection of the Green Revolution into South Korea. And as many of you, if you look into the research, there is a lot of, it's not conclusive that the Green Revolution was actually beneficial to the world, even though that's the standard narrative. And I'm not trying to play conspiracy theory or something, but I think there's a couple, and I can't remember the names of these studies, that actually talk about the more damages that it produced, especially today, in terms of its pressures that it's put on the environment, which is quite intense. And if you think about that, so in the 60s and 70s, perhaps it was very beneficial, but now it might have very quite problematic, especially its effect on the overall climate and environment. That's slow violence. That's exactly slow violence. And that's why I love Rob Nixon's term. I mean, it's so brilliant, slow violence. I mean, first of all, you don't think violence in a slow way. You think of it very overt, very fast. But he traces it and saying, no, we have to think of slow violence over time. And I would argue, unlike Japanese and Chinese studies, which is very much influenced by ruptures in their historiography, Korea is not about ruptures. It's about slow violence. It's about this gradual decline of people's livelihoods, of nature, the environment, and communities. So, but yeah, definitely Green Revolution connection.
Other questions? I think you had the concluding remarks, so we'll wrap up here, and please join me in thanking Professor Albert Park.